Welcome, everybody. We'll just wait a minute and let everyone come through. All right. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us today for our second webinar in a three-part series on grief and bereavement. My name is Amanda Marchette, and I'm a volunteer coordinator here at the United Way British Columbia on the volunteer engagement team. I'm also your host for today's webinar, and I'm just going to take a minute to introduce a few things before we head into the webinar itself. As we begin our work today, I'd like to acknowledge the many homelands and Indigenous people, as well as the territorial keepers of the lands that we're all working on. Each place that we're coming from today has its own distinct Indigenous governance systems, laws, cultures, and traditions. And we dedicate ourselves to better understanding and respecting and acknowledging the rich histories of the people from these lands that we come from. A few guidelines for our webinar for how we're spending our time together. Everyone will be muted through the course of our webinar, but please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. And if you like, you can turn on your automatic closed captioning using the CC feature in the toolbar. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a brief question period. So please feel free to use the Q&A chat feature there, or sorry, the Q&A feature to ask questions at any time, and then they'll be answered at the end. And then finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Healthy Aging Core. So please check it out after if you'd like to share this webinar with colleagues or revisit some of the themes. And just to situate us a little bit with the three webinars that we're doing here on grief and bereavement, the one that we did together was on anticipatory grief, and the recording is available on Core. Today, we're going to be focusing on moving through grief. And then finally, on March 26th at 1 p.m., the topic will be bereavement. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Deneve McCaffer, who is going to be our webinar presenter today. I'd like to share a little bit about Deneve. Deneve was born in Canmore, Alberta, where she attended the University of Alberta. She graduated as a physiotherapist in rehabilitation medicine in 1972. She worked as a chest physiotherapist for 10 years in ICU and cardiac recovery. She was the physio consultant on developing the home care program for the province of Alberta. The University of Alberta Hospital launched the palliative home care program to take people home to be with their loved ones. After she left that role, she was the physio on the home care team for the county of Strathcona, where she visited many clients in their homes. During this time, she started her own business, facilitating workshops in the area of interpersonal skills, self-care, communication, stress management, and building positive relationships with others. In 2010, she retired and moved back to the mountains that she loves, and her compassion for others has led her to volunteer throughout her entire adult life. In 2015, she became an end-of-life and bereavement visitor for the Hospice Society, and this has led her full circle back to working with the clients and supporting them at the end of their life, as well as the grief of losing someone they love. Deneve is presently the Columbia Valley Coordinator for the Caregivers Network of East Kootenay Seniors, where she facilitates workshops and presentations. So thank you so much, Deneve, for joining us today, for bringing your expertise and wisdom to us all, and really looking forward to hearing what you have to share today.
Thank you, Amanda. It's nice to see you both again. And I look forward to this. Last time I was a bit nervous. This time I'm a bit better. By the next one, I'll be just fine. So I need to get this up and running here. The first thing I want to talk about is there is a need in grief to know that not everybody grieves alone or the same. No two people are alike because it depends on your relationship. It depends on your experience in life. Have you gone through a passing before? Depends on your beliefs, etc. But one of the most important things in working with people through grief is building trust. Building trust in the relationship itself. So I'm going to start with something called Understanding You, Understanding Me, which was developed by Tommy Thomas of Boston, Texas. And I went down a long time ago and trained with him. And it's one of those personality indicators, but I really like this one because it's a relational one. It's how we relate to each other, and that's where the focus is. So knowing a person's tendencies and strengths help us to communicate. If I know what your natural strengths are, I know how to communicate with you. Carl Jung defined personality strengths that we are born with. So it's understanding self and others, help identify these strengths. There's 3 pairings that I'm going to go through. The first pairing is thinking strength. And thinking strength is where you process the information before speaking. So it's thought before action. And you know that person. I know that person because that person's not me. And so when they have grief, they work through it by themselves. While risking strength are those that are more outgoing. And so it's action followed by thought. So they speak openly, easily, without thinking about it. So it's not that they can't think, and it's not that thinking people can't risk, but it's a natural tendency. So when you're working with people of these strengths, when you're with someone who's a thinking strength, you need to give them time to process what you've said. Give them time to think before you ask another question. Risking strength will openly share what they're thinking. So just asking the questions, they'll start to share the answer. So that's the first pairing. The second pairing is how we make decisions. Practical people are fact-based. And when somebody in their life is ill or dying or something's happened to someone, you want to know the facts. You tend to want to really know what time did it happen, was it anybody with them, etc. That's the practical strength. It's A to B to C, very sequential. They focus on results and getting the answers. Theoretical people focus on ideas and they like the big picture and they want to know everything and kind of the why. The practical is how it happened. The theoretical is why did it happen? And they focus on process. And so it's the process they need to understand. Was there a doctor here when it happened? Were they by themselves? Like they need the whole big picture before they can move on. The last pairing is called dependent and independent. It doesn't mean dependent as dependent with someone else or codependent. It means that you're relational and you like to talk about what happened. You like to share, you like to talk about it. They will be phoning people up and sharing on the phone, which is how they start to deal with grief. Independent people self-solve. They'll go for a walk, they'll go sit by a river, whatever they do to help them sit back and think about it, and especially if they're thinking, and self-solve. They don't need other people to help them. They're slow to communicate what their needs are because they're very good at that. So let's get in now to the slide presentation. I put a slide up about anticipatory grief because it's in case you didn't come. Anticipatory grief is the common, both among the caregiver and the person they're working with, often occurring simultaneously. Anticipatory grief is defined as grief that occurs before the loss. And that grief can be very sad because you have different things that occur. You're worried, you're fearful, and that makes a difference. My husband's adjusting my screen. Okay, thank you, dear. It's good. He's very caregiving. So anticipatory grief does not stop the grieving after the person passes. In fact, usually people are surprised that they still grieve as much after the person passes. Death leaves a headache that no one can heal. Love leaves a memory that no one can steal. I really like that quote. Love leaves a memory that no one can steal. We now grieve the loss of the person who's no longer there. There's no hope, more hope. Now we're going to get into the actual passing. That's the light going out. Can you still see me? Oh, good. Accepting the loss is part of it. Expecting them to walk through the door is something else you hope for. That's the holding on. I just had a friend who lost her husband a few weeks ago, and she still sees him coming through the door. Wishful thinking, wishing that they hadn't passed, and feeling lonely. So sometimes you have to accept the fact that certain things will never go back to how they used to be. And my mind still talks to you. My heart still looks for you, but my soul knows you are at peace. I miss you every day. And that's what she's going through. And she's quite surprised that that's happening for her. So you have to also say goodbye. When my dad was dying, he was so worried about my mom that I had to ask her to go in and let go and say goodbye because he was holding on for her. So sometimes just being there, that happened. Sometimes just being there for someone can sometimes bring hope when all else is hopeless or seems hopeless. Don't wait until it's too late to tell someone how much you love them and how much you care about them. Because when they're gone, no matter how loud you shout or cry, they won't hear you anymore. And that's often how people feel when someone passes. Feelings of grief, shock and numbness. When you hear the news, it's often a shock feeling because you cannot deal with the pain of loss. Denial and disbelief. Yearning is having them come home and that they come back. Fear, it feels like fear. You get explosive emotions. All of a sudden, you'll be angry about what's happened. Guilt and regret. Sad and joy, survivor. So you start to feel guilt that you didn't say things, guilt that you weren't there, regret that you didn't talk about something that was important to both of you. And then you start to feel the relief and you're sad and joy comes together and then you feel like you're in the survival mode. Sadness of events you have planned. I have a friend who had planned to go to Europe this summer and her husband has Alzheimer's and he's no longer able to travel like that. I had to cancel my cruise this summer because I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. So those kind of things bring sadness. Being alone is another thing, especially the loneliness that comes in the evening. If you're sitting there by yourself with nobody there, or no phone calls from that person anymore. So those are some of the feelings of grief that we go through. So what is grief? It's an external expression of loss. It happens automatically because of the expression of love. The grief is love's twin. We do not get one without the other. So the more you love someone, the more grief you'll experience. Mourning is the outward expression of grief. And we'll get into that when we get into bereavement. But you feel the pain inside, and when you express the pain, that's the outward expression of the grief. So that will be crying, screaming, wailing, however that happens. Going for a long run. Anything that helps you get it out. Going and chopping wood. There's lots of ways that we can outwardly express our grief. Grief effects on us is not just emotional, but also physical. We start to get tummy aches. We start to feel weaker socially. We're not visiting as much. We don't want to see people as much. And spiritually, it's the loss of someone that you were really connected to. So there's a spiritual loss as well. This is Doug and my first dog. His name is Yoda, and he was a golden retriever. And he died at the age of 8. He had a tummy turn, and he had all sorts of things go on. And then he just got cancer in his bones. And it was a really sad loss because it's the first dog that Doug and I had together. And I remember he had this red cardinal. And in the veterinary clinic, as we're putting him down, he dragged his hind legs behind him and dropped the red cardinal in my lap. And the vet said, "He wants you to have it. He's saying goodbye." So he's a dog that we were very connected to. So the loss of a pet can be very hard. The passing of a loved one, losing a job or career that was important to you, your children moving out, leaving home, that can also cause grief. A divorce, that can be a different kind of grief because there might be a lot of anger or sadness with that. Loss of a house. So in the fires, I think about all the people that lost their homes and all their belongings and their memories. Physical disability, that changes you, and you grieve the loss of being able to run or walk without assistance. Loss of a volunteer role. I volunteered for one organization for almost 10 years, and they just decided that they didn't need me any longer, but they didn't tell me that. They wrote a letter, and I was doing so much for them. It was full-time work almost, and they just decided they didn't want me anymore. And I never did find out, but loss of a volunteer role and loss of a relationship. And that can be a close friend. My friend who's 94, who I've known since 1970, is in ICU in Calgary. And so that might be a loss of a relationship coming up. But those are all losses, and I'm sure you can think of more. But those are what causes grief. Then there's the types of grief we have. We've got sudden passing of a loved one. And that means there was no information that it was going to happen. They just all of a sudden passed. And that's a heavy grief because there's a lot of unfinished things that would want to have happened. A traumatic death is another one. Suicide, an accident, illness, an end-of-life diagnosis. Complicated grief for those that leave. There's a word missing. Complicated grief for those that leave without being able to share or to understand why. And you didn't know they were going to die. So one of the complicated grief one of my friends is going through, her father was in the hospital with a broken hip. He was fine when she left at lunch. And when she came back, he was gone. And there's many parts to that, but the complication was they didn't know why. And all of these may leave a hole in your heart. And it does feel like a hole if you've lost people you love. I'm sorry about that word. Misconceptions about grief. This is Dr. Ellen Wolfelt, who is in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I've had the opportunity to train with him twice. And he's kind of the world guru on grief. He's got, I think, almost 100 books printed every time he comes up with a new topic. When I went down and was working with him, he said, I got a book for you. Because I had done it on anticipatory grief. He said, you should call it Letting Go, or Saying Hello Before You Say Goodbye. He said, that would be a good title for the book. So that's the kind of man he is. He just shares and wants it. You can look him up online if you're looking for a specific type of grief that you're dealing with. Grief and mourning proceed a predictable and orderly manner. That's a misconception. There's no orderly manner in it. You should move away from grief, not towards it. If you move away, the grief gets pushed down and the healing doesn't take place. Tears are a sign of weakness, especially or particularly for men. That's not true. Tears is the mourning, and it's a releasing of the pain, which you have to do. And people cry in public, and that's okay. In fact, I have boxes of Kleenexes when I do my sessions, and I promote people to cry. It's really important. Mourning means you're being weak in your faith. I don't think that is true. I think our faith helps us through the mourning process, but I don't think it means you're weak. You need to get over your grief as quickly as possible. Let's move on. Let's go out. Let's do this. Let's come for supper. And those things aren't really important right now. Grief that lasts a long time is abnormal. That's not true either. There's some people that will grieve 2-3 years, depending on how the person died. Our average for grieving someone is 3 months before we can start to move on. The person who died would not want you to be sad. They may not want you to cry and be sad and wish you weren't, but they understand that. The more you love someone, the sadder it is. This is an important topic because I've had an opportunity, I guess, not a blessing, to be with people that have gone through traumatic grief. So when they go through a traumatic grief, like a friend dying or drowning, they have to go through the trauma first before they can start to grieve. So they need to talk about the trauma over and over, how it happened, and really look at how you deal with that trauma. Another friend here, son got killed in a motorcycle accident. That's the trauma. So they have to deal with the trauma before they can even move into grieving. The more violent the loss is, the more traumatic we consider it. It occurs without warning. It's untimely. So that could be something like a car accident or a climbing accident or an avalanche. It's just happened up a panel. It may involve violence. The damage to one's body is something also very traumatic. The griever often sees it as preventable. If I had only had them stay a bit longer, then that wouldn't have happened. I have a friend in Louisiana whose son came for Sunday dinner and drove out on the road, which never has traffic on it, and turned left to go home, and a car ran into him. And he died instantly. That was right in front of their house. So they really felt if they had only stayed 5 minutes longer or 10 minutes longer, if I had them go home a little bit earlier. So that's where you see the preventable, or if we hadn't invited them for dinner. So the griever may have witnessed the death as well, and that's traumatic. Believed that loved ones suffered. That's another part of the trauma that they might have suffered. And then the guilt. And that's even though they may not have been with you, but your guilt because you just told them not to drive home in the dark, or told them there's a storm coming in, or whatever it is. And so then you feel really badly. So you have to get over the trauma before you can start grieving. Unexpected losses. A sudden and unforeseen death of someone close to you. Unfinished business. That's a big one. If you haven't finished your business with that person or talked about things, then that's an unexpected loss, but you didn't have the chance. Being unprepared for the grief. You didn't know that they were going to die, or you didn't know what grief was. Get a profound sense of shock. Intense emotional impact. Lack of time to process it. Difficulty of accepting it. An impact on your daily life. And grief can also linger. I have had friends where the grief lingers for them, and every day they wake up thinking about it. They wake up in the morning and it takes them a moment to realize what's happened. And it can linger for a long time unless you work through it. Circumstances of death that affect how we grieve. Out of order death. If your grandchild dies before you or your child dies before you, that's out of order death. Uncertainty surrounding the death. There's somebody I know in the community right now who's trying to find out what happened. They weren't expected to die. And their children are really pushing for answers. So uncertainty surrounding the death, or if it was a suicide, was it an overdose? Why did it happen? Physical distance from the death. If you're far away, it may seem that you're not involved, but there's a lot of guilt that comes in with physical distance from the death. You were going to go next week, but decided not to. Or you should have gone sooner, so you start shitting on yourself. Self-blame for the death. Those are the should-haves. You blame yourself because of something you did or something you said, or they were angry when they left. So there's lots of things we can self-blame for the death. A history of conflict in the relationship, unresolved conflict. That was my brother. He was out helping us at the house. He left with getting paid and then left, and I was angry. I was very angry. And we hadn't talked for a year, and he died in a car accident. So history of unresolved conflict. Disenfranchised in the relationship, not openly and not acknowledging the relationship. Secondary loss is part of the grief. Loss of finances, loss of job, loss of house. There's a whole bunch of secondary jobs. For me, it would be, I can't manage on my own. So that would be a secondary loss for me if my partner, my husband died. Concerns, stressors in the griever's life, that can also affect you. The griever's culture and the cultural background, because everybody grieves differently. If I think of work I did with some Indigenous person in my support group, I was not on the mark for how they grieve. So I had to go learn how they grieve. Some people, like in Ireland, where they have a wake for days on end. So the griever's religion is another thing, your faith, your belief system, your spirituality. And then we've got carried grief. My daughter's best friend in grade 1 died. And I don't know if she carried that grief. I know she spent time with the family. And then when she was 15, her young boyfriend was coming to visit for the evening, and he and his dad died at a train track. Those are carried grief. And if we carry grief and we don't reconcile with it, you can become more sensitive to grief, and it can start causing illnesses in your body. And romanticizing the grief itself. I hope this is a good speed for you. Grief is a journey. There's no map. It's like a journey through the wilderness of loss. You don't know where the path is going to take you. You don't know what's on the other side. There's no timetable for the final destination, and it's not in sight. We meander back and forth, round and round, loop back on itself. We may cover the same ground over and over again, And part of this journey is something called grief bursts, where you're going out and you're going to a place where you and your loved one spent time, and there's a memory, or you smell something that brings a memory, like my mom's apple pie. And all of a sudden, you'll just start crying. And so those are grief bursts, and you don't know when they're going to happen, but they just happen. And that's part of the healing as well. Every grief is unique. I don't know what happened there. Every grief is unique. No two people are alike. The length of grief is determined by connection. So the bigger the connection with someone, the longer you will grieve them. Find out how their grief is different. What are the losses and second losses that people go through? We are not there to fix them. We cannot resolve their loss. We do not resolve, but we reconcile it. In time, we reconcile it into our life by going forward with good memories and bringing them along with us. And that's called reconciliation. The greatest tool for being present. It takes 2 years to learn to talk. I like that one. And 60 years to learn to be quiet. And especially for us risking theoretical dependent strengths, we like to talk. We don't have a communication problem. We have a listening problem. So listen, please listen, listen, I need to share. So when you're with someone who may be dying, you have to have a listening problem or a listening with them. So if we listen and understand, not to respond, but just understand, it helps them share what they're going on. Often in my groups, I'll be sharing or somebody will be sharing and I say, well, we always wait for them to finish because we don't know how deep it's going to go or what they're going to say, but something triggers a thought in someone else and they just have to say it. So that is where we have our challenges, is listening without changing the thought process or hijacking the conversation. So that's what listening is. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories here. And this is the Wolfelt saying about saying hello before you say goodbye. I have a grandson who was 16 at the time, who was staying with us here. And he got a call that his grandfather was dying. And he didn't want to go. He didn't want to see it. He didn't want to be part of it. So we talked and I sat beside him and I said, you know, one thing that's really important is that you get to say goodbye. And you're doing it for your grandfather. He would be so happy if you were by his bedside and you get to say goodbye and tell him what you appreciate about him. So saying goodbye to a grandfather, saying hello before you say goodbye. I'm going to read you a story. It's a friend of mine by the name of Christy Bennett, and it's in the appendix. When we get there, you'll see the story. 10 years ago today, my mom died. It's really sad. There's so many little things I keep inside now. Things only meant for a mom. A little black hole has been left in my heart. Words that will never be spoken. But I can handle that. It's a one-way conversation now as I whisper them, as I believe that she still hears me. I think the saddest thing about losing mom is that I never really got to know her, like deeply know who she was. I always thought there would be time for that, us having deep conversations beyond children and grandchildren and husbands. I dreamed of knowing my mom's history, her private struggles, and her life dreams. I dreamed of sharing mine with her too, but that will never happen. But when I think, would this type of relation materialize between mom and I? Am I engaging in wishful thinking? Mom was very good at keeping her private struggles on the inside, and so was I. Before Mom died, I suffered a lot in silence, something very much role modeled for me in my life. It wasn't until my mom was dying that I realized how painful silence is. When Mom was on her deathbed, Mom refused to discuss her past, present, and future. I longed for those conversations. I craved to know this woman before she died, her losses, her fears, her hopes. But she couldn't go there. I get that. Mom was skilled at protecting her children from pain. Silence and stuffing pain, pull things down inside, creates distance and connection. I didn't learn this lesson until Mom died. A great gift came from the greatest heartbreak. I learned how much my silence was hurting me. I was continuing the cycle of self-loathing and disconnection to protect those around me. It's probably why I work as a therapist now, to empower other women who have lost their voice. Mom struggled for many years to love herself, to feel worthy of her dreams. Mom, I love you, and I miss you every single day. I honor the gifts that you gave me: compassion, empathy, and kindness. In the pain of losing you, I found my voice and my wings. Your legacy continues on in me when I help others do the same. You will never be forgotten. XOXO, Chris. So when I read that testimony, I thought it hit so many points of what happens in relationships, especially with children and mothers and fathers, where we don't openly share things. Being present with someone who is dying. You listen to understand what they're saying. You acknowledge their feelings. You listen for clues. Some people have dementia or Alzheimer's or some type of form where they can't talk. To watch their body language. You learn a lot by facial expressions. And you can guess and say things, but listening for clues on what they want or what they're saying. Engage them by sharing news. Try to bring a lightness into the room. If you want someone to respond, they must know we are present and listening. And that was my dad. So the other part of all this, and we went through this in anticipatory grief, is taking care of yourself. I had a friend that sat vigil with her husband for 4 days. And she was burnt out when it finished. So even then, you need to go for walks. You need to do things to look after you, because none of us can go through without being scathed. So you look after your physical self. You look after your emotional self. Talking to others on the team in the United Way. Cognitive self, gathering information. Knowing things that will really help you. Your social self, spending time with others. Spending time with others is really important, because you probably haven't laughed in a while, or you're so worried. The other one is your spiritual self, and that can be meditation, prayer, being in nature, sitting under a tree, smelling flowers, whatever it is. But caring for yourself, there's 5 different selves. There's the physical, emotional, cognitive, social, and spiritual self. And all of those need to be looked after. So I'd like to thank you, the United Way, the caregivers of these Kootenai seniors, where I've learned a lot, the Invermere Public Library for allowing me to use the space, and all the people I've had to honor to be with when they passed. And I have done that a few times with home care as well as hospice clients. So I'd like to thank the hospice clients and what they taught me. Also, the home care of the Strathcona County and the University of Alberta Hospital. And most importantly, all the caregivers that have helped me to understand their learnings. I've learned more from my caregiver group than I thought I'd ever know because they share their experiences and it's not just what I know or have learned. Take time to mourn the loss. That's our next session, which is bereavement. Time passes and we have to mourn the loss. They have to move to their grief into mourning the loss. So you move from grief into mourning, and that's the outward expression of grief. You re-engage in your life and you start doing things again. And I said a little while ago, it's not, you don't resolve it. You do reconciliation, which you bring it into your life. So you bring the person with you and you have linking objects where you can look at their picture or different things that help you as well. So that's what the bereavement will be about in a month's time. And I would like to thank you very much for being part of this webinar. And I hope you got some things out of it. And again, maybe by the third one, I'll get better at the opening. But anyway, thank you for attending. And thank you very much to the United Way for putting these on.
Mhm. Well, Deneve, thank you so much on behalf of everyone who has been listening and soaking up your experiences and wisdom. I'm seeing a lot of hearts coming up on the screen. I know that my heart is very affected right now, and I just want to thank you for talking about the things that are often unspoken. And for the folks that are watching, if you have a question that you'd like to ask Deneve, please put it in the chat or the Q&A, whatever you feel comfortable. We do have about 10 minutes, so if there's something that you want to ask about her experience or something in your experience, please feel free to bring it forward. And while we're waiting for people to think of those things, I just want to offer to the group that Deneve's sharing about self-care, something that we can all endeavor to do after we sign off today, to take care and attend to ourselves. And for some of us who are more independent, that could be going for a walk, stretching, um, journaling. And for those of us who are here today who are more dependent on the scale that Deneve shared, that could be connecting with a coworker if you're working in an office, or co-regulating with your dog if they're beside you. Whatever it is where you need that connection with someone, please do it. Yeah, so if you have any, we do have a question in like a chat, so I'll just read it out. So it was shared, I often worry about saying the wrong thing when someone is grieving. I wonder if you have any advice on how best to support someone who is grieving.
I sure do, and we're going to get that in part into bereavement as well. When somebody's grieving, the first question I ask is, can you tell me how you're doing today? And they may say, fine, or I'm fine, or whatever. And then I say, can you tell me what fine means? What your fine is? And what that does is it starts the conversation. And it's finding those opening lines that help them begin to share. You can also look at pictures on the wall of their family. There might be a wedding picture, pictures of their children. And so just saying to them, can you tell me about this picture? So there's lots of ways to open the conversation. And then what you do, the last statement they made, that's the statement you pick up on and repeat back. So if they say, I'm fine, I say, can you tell me what fine means? Or I've had a hard day. What was hard about your day? So that's kind of the way of having people open up and share with you on a very hard topic. And the other thing, if they start to cry, don't hand them a Kleenex. Put the Kleenex beside them before you start, because if you hand them a Kleenex, it will break through what they're sharing. So you just have the Kleenex available for them to choose to use it. And if they don't answer right away, you give them time, because people sometimes need to process that question or process how they're feeling. And so I can sit up for 5 minutes and not say a word. And if they're not looking at me and their head is down, you know they're thinking. And that's really important, to give that time to process what they want to say. And the first time I had somebody come in who had a traumatic death, her husband shot himself. She came in, and for weeks on end, she didn't say a word. She just sat. And I didn't say anything. I just let her be present with me. And she'd say, well, thank you, that was good, and walk out. And so it took a while for her to get there. But if you're dealing with someone that is dying and knowing what to say, just ask them to share how they're doing. And they may just use a one word like fine or whatever, and then you go on to tell me more about fine. What does that mean? Does that make sense?
Thank you. That really, yeah, I've seen some hearts. It sounds like openness and curiosity and holding space are important in the response, and allowing silence, not having to fill it and rush in to fill it.
And curiosity is a wonderful word. I sometimes say, I'm not here being nosy. I'm just curious at how you're doing. Because curiosity is a very wonderful invitation.
And I guess sometimes you make the invitation and someone can know then that they might circle around next time. They might need, like you say, some space, and they may not take you up on it right away, but they know that you've put it out there. You've made that invitation.
Especially thinking strength.
Mm.
Even saying, can I come and see you? That might be something they need to think about. So then giving them that space again is important. I was going to say, I have a thinking straight husband who's looking at me, so I shouldn't say anything. But he self-solves. He's thinking independent, so he self-solves quite nicely. But with me being risking dependent, guess what I need? I need to talk about it. So we compromised on that one.
Good partnership for sure.
Yeah.
Well, seeing that we have no other questions, again, I just really want to encourage everyone to take those few moments when we say goodbye and take care of yourself. And please register for the third piece. And Denise, thank you again for sharing your life experience. The stories are so helpful. They bring to life the content, what you're sharing. They make it really hit the heart in a good way. So thank you so much. And
Can I make one comment on the bereavement? The bereavement will allow us to look at what we do about it and how we move forward. And that's really important.
it is. Okay.